I'm Douglas Wilson with the Center for Higher Ambition Leadership. Today I'm speaking with Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, who's a valued member of the Center's nonprofit community. When we speak with member companies, a big area of focus is how to operationalize leadership to grow mission and purpose. It's one thing to capture goals and ideals on paper, but it's another to bring that into the everyday operations of the business. Achieving a distinct purpose while still driving outstanding performance requires dedicated and disciplined leadership. Mark Bertolini and the senior team at Aetna have demonstrated just that. They have moved purpose into action by working diligently to build trust with all of their stakeholders, which is no small effort. Congratulations, Mark.
Thank you.
So Mark, as we think about this journey and where you've been, and we talk about higher ambition and the purpose of our center, which is to help leaders build purposeful organizations that are high performing and change the world. When we put that in the context of Aetna, what is your higher ambition vision for Aetna?
Well, I think the way we think about it is that healthcare costs are a budget buster here in the United States and around the world. And in every family household, it can be the largest line item in their family budget. And so it's crowding out a lot of opportunity for people to participate in the economy. And I think our job is to figure out how to fix that. And so as we think about it, instead of just being an insurance company, we need to be a company using the data we have for being in the insurance business to begin to develop solutions to that problem. And if we can fix it, then we fix the nation's economy and free American households to reestablish the middle class.
So that's a higher ambition for sure.
That is.
How long have you been after this, Mark, with this kind of ambitious vision?
I think the company's been after it for about 11 years. In 2005, we decided that enough was enough, that healthcare costs were not getting any better and that we needed to find new solutions. And so it's been sort of a random walk since then of, you know, let's build this, let's try that, let's push this issue with policymakers, let's build capabilities in these arenas. And I would say that we fail fast in most cases. But that not everything works, but our ability to develop the internally generated capital to keep investing starts very first and foremost with executing against our expectations of our shareholders and our customers.
Yeah.
And when we do that, then we should generate the capital to be able to innovate.
Yeah. And you talk about without margin, there's no mission.
Right.
That's a famous quote by you.
Actually, it's a quote from Sister Joyce DeShano of the Sisters of the Daughters of Charity, who was the chairwoman of the Ascension Health System. So that is their motto.
Okay, yeah. Excellent, excellent. And you've embraced that motto. And what you're saying, we had a learning visit with you today, and we had the opportunity for you to talk about that you've got to build performance or you don't have room to innovate. You don't have room to pursue this kind of higher ambition.
Right. I think because higher ambition is not sort of ingrained in the ethos of American business and capitalism, people that are pioneers have to earn the right to step beyond the boundaries of what is considered traditionally acceptable business practices.
Yeah.
And so just like our efforts in yoga and mindfulness and in sleep and all those other sorts of things, that all comes as a result of meeting the expectations of the traditional system. Once we get past and more widely acceptable that we can do these things as businesses, as we redefine capitalism, then maybe everybody can do it. But I would say that unless we perform, we don't get the chance to do this stuff.
When you talk about redefining capitalism, can you talk a little bit more about that, what that means?
Well, I think if we're always defined by the generations we're in. I grew up during the Vietnam War and the '60s protests and all that sort of thing, and we were defined that defined our era: rock and roll, peace, love, all that sort of stuff. And now we're with the millennial generation, who actually have 3 Ps that they use to evaluate organizations. It's people, planet, and then profit. And so that's the coming generation. And unless as organizations we're prepared to address those issues with employees, it's going to be hard to attract talent. And so I'd say what that through those 3 Ps represent, people, planet, and profit, they really represent a social ecosystem around businesses and social media and the way we communicate. The corporation no longer defines truth. Truth is defined from many axes throughout the economy, and people are smart enough to put those together. So our role in the community, how we engage with our governments, how we engage with all our stakeholders, is going to be as important as whether or not we have a good bottom line. And so this sort of social ecosystem of running a business is the new capitalism. It's, how are we taking care of people? How are we taking care of the planet? And then what kind of profit are we generating? And is that profit being put to good use in taking care of people on the planet?
Very articulate, thank you. And so building on that, speaking of different stakeholders you talk about building new relationships, collaborative relationships with your providers.
Right.
Maybe you could talk about that and give me an example of how you're doing that and building trust with those kind of providers.
Well, I think the economy is so matrixed and so complex. It's global. Our governments like to think they control their economies, but I think our governance models have been outgrown by our economies. And so we have these businesses that are connected in so many different ways to so many different places and so many different stakeholders. We have to figure out how to manage that. And being singularly focused on the customer, defining who the customer is the first priority, because we know our customer are the people that use our services. But then how do we engage all the other stakeholders to support us in that mission? And in order to do that, you have to make connections and share data that in the past, particularly in our industry, we would have considered to be proprietary. And stuff that we own. We need to let go of that control in order to gain power over a social ecosystem that's aimed on the customer and bringing together all the skills necessary to provide the kind of quality of service they need.
Can you give me an illustration of how you've let go of data to actually improve that customer experience?
Back in the 90s, we had this system called capitation where we used to write a check every month to providers for each patient or member that we had. Their patients are members. And that would be it. We'd send them a check with the patient's name and their social security number and their member ID number and the check amount. And it was on a green bar report. And I used to deliver these. I was at that level of my career. And it had big rubber band around each side. And the check was in an envelope underneath it. And we said, good luck with that. Well, the hospitals and the physicians didn't know about what is called incurred but not reported, that there are services going on in the system somewhere that are not yet reflected in the claims. And so as a result, they all started to go bankrupt. And so in the late 90s, capitation systems blew up across the country and systems went bankrupt. And so this time around, we actually have to give them all the data. We had the data back then, we just didn't share it with them. And so now we have to give them the data. We have to give them a 360-degree view of the person they're taking care of. And we have to be willing to let that go, even though it may be an admission against self-interest on our part about what's going on inside the system. That creates a transparency in the dialogue and the negotiation that comes to fairer relationships, which I think are more sustainable and trusting relationships to create longer-term business models.
So is there an example where you actually gave this data and it resulted in like a better patient outcome that you could give us in something like that?
So in a couple of places. Early on in 2006, we have a tool even today called Active Health. And this tool looks for omissions and commissions in care.
Okay.
So, things that haven't been done that should be done or things that are being done that shouldn't be done.
Right.
And one of our first instances was a patient who received a prescription for metformin, which is an oral diabetic drug. Metformin is contraindicated in cases of renal insufficiency or renal disease. And this endocrinologist only had one view of the patient, which was they were in their office for their diabetes. Well, we actually had data that showed that they were seeing a nephrologist and that their serum creatinine, the indication of their kidney health, was getting worse. And we saw the prescription come through. And we sent a note to the doctor, both doctors saying, you guys need to talk because this patient shouldn't be on metformin. You're going to destroy their kidneys, and they're already compromised to begin with. And we saved that patient's kidneys.
Wow.
And who knows what that would have been for the rest of their life. So that's a small instance.
Yeah.
In bigger instances, we now have partnerships with systems like Innova in Northern Virginia, 60% of the market, where we've agreed to share data, create a joint venture company. We've given them our intellectual property and our membership in that region. They've given us capital. And we now work together on a product that over the last 3 years has been the fastest growing product in the marketplace and is 15 to 20% lower than the Blue Cross Blue Shield product in the marketplace with better quality and is profitable, generating the margin to continue to invest in the business. But it took us being willing to give up that intellectual property of how to manage risk, give up the technology to support their claims administration, give up our membership in exchange for them contributing capital to a new way of working together with providers.
And so you were able to drive the cost down to get below the other
Competitors
in that marketplace. That's significantly, 10 to 15%.
15 to 20.
15 to 20%. Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So you also talk about the social compact with employees. That's a fundamental term you have used before, the social compact.
Right.
How it's being worked out with your employees. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I grew up on the east side of Detroit in a, what today would be considered a relatively poor family. We didn't know that one back then.
Yeah.
We thought we were great. Sort of like Woebegone, we're all smarter and brighter and handsomer. We didn't have insurance half the time because my dad was a pattern maker in the auto industry. And so 6 months out of the year he didn't work, and so we didn't have health insurance. But my mother worked for a pediatrician's office, and so she was the health insurance system. She came home with the vaccines in her pocket and would chase us down the street and give us our shots. And we got treated, pro bono by the pediatrician's office that she worked for. And there were 6 of us within 7 years, so we were, a typical Italian-Irish family. And as I grew up, my expectations were to do a little bit better than my dad did. And in 1979, after flunking out of college the second time, I went to work in the plants, putting together rear axles at Ford Motor Company Sterling Gear and Axle plant, and actually went back to school, and I got frustrated with my union steward and said, I can do my job better than that. How do I get your job? And I ended up getting an MBA, and here I am running a big company. So where I came from was, with a stark realization of that way of life. Right. And so when I got to a level in the organization where I was actually in charge, it was, okay, well, here's my agenda. I want to do all these sorts of cool things. And I have people around me that make sure that I don't go too far too fast. And so we introduced yoga. And then, about 2 years into my tenure, I started talking about, geez, this middle class problem is really a big problem. 2008 happened. Income inequality is a major driver of the political dialogue right now. I gave everybody a copy of Thomas Piketty's book for Christmas in 2011, saying, here, read this. And finally I said, what do we need to do to, who are the people? And I travel around and I visit everybody in their cubicle, and I was hearing about how hard it was for people to make ends meet. And so I said to the human resources team, will you tell me who are these people? Who are our lowest paid people in the organization? What are their lives like? What are their families like? And that was a major ask. We didn't know. And it took us too long, from my perspective, to get that information. But when we got it, we found that we had, largely single mothers working in our call and claim centers, who had a large percentage of their children on Medicaid and a significant portion of their families on food stamps. And they were working for an insurance company. So I said to the team, what do we need to do to fix this problem? That shouldn't be that way. And is there a way for us to structure better compensation for them? And they were averaging about $12.50, $13 an hour. Some as low as $12 an hour. That was our lowest wage. And I said, what would be a fair wage? Well, maybe 13 and a quarter. I said, no, that just doesn't feel like it's enough. Why don't, and we argue back and forth, and of course the spreadsheet rules everything. And I said, $16, let's look at $16. And what we found out at $16 is that people started losing benefits because they're getting paid more, and they were going into higher tax brackets. So we started looking at, what can we do to improve their personal disposable income? And so that was a benefits question. And so we said, for certain levels of the federal poverty level, 300% and under, what can we do to eliminate cost sharing in exchange for their engagement? And that's why we call it a social compact. I want to call it a social contract, but the lawyers inside the organization wouldn't let me use that word.
Yeah.
So it'd be a social compact, which, I guess
goes
sounds
back to the Pilgrims.
more detente and Russian and that sort of thing. And we looked at it and said, what could we do to eliminate their cost sharing at certain levels of the federal poverty level in exchange for their agreement to engage in disease management programs? And so we'll take care of you if you take care of yourself. And so we've been on that journey for the last year and a half. It's still too early to tell. Our engagement scores are way up. Our turnover's way down. I get a lot of hugs in the hall. So, all of that works, but until we get through some time here. But it'll cost us about $27 million by the time we're done for the Aetna employees. When we finish the Humana acquisition, there's another 10,000 employees that will be impacted.
Okay.
And so the number will jump to $78 million a year for us to make that investment. But I think it's a worthy investment, and we'll see. But we had to get beyond what's truth to a very important question of what do we need to believe in order for us to take this risk.
And you're willing to take that risk, step out on it, and say, this is what we believe. We believe it's important that people have this ability to have a living wage, if you will.
And to participate in success.
Yeah.
I mean, here we were, record stock price, record revenue, record earnings, executives getting paid a fortune on their stock option gains,
Right.
and we had people on food stamps and Medicaid.
Right.
What's wrong with this picture?
Yeah.
And I think that was, it just wasn't fair. And so, when things aren't fair, you don't necessarily need to have perfect information to make a decision.
Right, right. Well, that'll be very interesting to see how that shapes up over time. I'd like to come back in 2 years and see what you've learned there. That'll be really fascinating.
It'll be interesting, yep.
Yeah. So you mentioned today in our learning visit that you also have certain, I would call them operating principles about how you deal with people, like believing in positive intent.
Right.
Maybe list off a few of those that you rattled off in our learning visit today.
Higher consideration for people than task.
Okay.
Being present in the moment. Delivering bad news early and personally, which means you can't kill the messenger. And then, assuming positive intent in everything everyone does. And when you don't notice, when you can't find that positive intent, the onus is on you to figure out what you need to learn from that person, what they're trying to teach you, and the way they're approaching things. And I think that and a whole host of other things around, we evaluate all of our executives, all of our managers. Anybody that manages a person inside the company has 50% of their incentive compensation is based off of a scorecard, and everybody in the company has a scorecard. And the other 50% is based on leadership behaviors that we identify as important. And everybody has a standard set of them, and then for each individual as part of their development plan, everybody has their own sort of quirkiness that they need to work on.
Okay.
And so in our company, you can get great results and still only get half of your incentive if you're a jerk. And so those leadership behaviors are around developing people, around encouraging innovation, about having open dialogue, developing followership, all those sorts of things that are a little fluffy from some people's perspective, but I think incredibly important in this, again, next generation of what these social ecosystems that corporations are becoming in the next era of capitalism.
One of the things I think about when I think about a social compact is this attitude of serving others. How does that fit into the Aetna culture? Do you use that term?
I use stewardship,
Okay.
which always scares the financial people because they say, we're a commercial enterprise. How can you be a steward? Well, I think, one of the great stories of American wealth will be the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves kind of passage of wealth in families in 3 generations. Usually it takes 3 generations for people from made the
Right.
money to losing it all.
Right, right.
And so what is stewardship? And this is, I spend time with my own children. Stewardship is taking the gifts you've been given them, use them wisely so that they continue on. And wealth isn't about building buildings with your name on it or acquiring things that look pretty. It's about leaving an impact behind that is positive and carries on the mission of what you were trying to accomplish. And so this sort of idea of impact and stewardship is incredibly important.
You mentioned too this story of, you said if you don't understand someone, work to understand. That's not quite the way you said it, but
Right.
it was. Can you give us a story of maybe when that happened to you, when you didn't understand somebody and you had to really work to understand?
Well, the hard part about leadership development is that we all love to hang around with people that really do good stuff, right? They're smart, they're energetic, they're successful. We always want to hang out with winners, right?
Yeah.
As Tom Petty says.
Yeah.
And you're out there with winners. And the hardest part about leadership development is actually dealing with the people who are not performing. And too often leaders ignore them and they continue to fail or they leave. And so one of the things that I think is incredibly important to understand about underperformance is that there are 3 reasons why people underperform. One of them is that they're a sociopath. They actually want to do badly. And that's a very small percentage of society. And we can see them. Those people are easy to figure out, right? They kind of jump out at you.
Yeah.
The other 2 is that the person doesn't know how to do it or they're not suited to do it. It's just not in their interest to do the work. I fix broken things and build new things. I hate making the trains run on time. I can do it, but it's not a job I'm suited to do. And so the only way you find out whether or not they don't know how to do it or they're not suited to do it is you actually have to spend time with them. And you have to work through the issues and talk about expectations and even get to the point of reducing the cycle time on one-on-ones. And I've even gone to the point of, let's look at your calendar and see how you're spending your day.
Okay.
Who are you spending time with? Who are you talking to on the phone? Do you get out to the site visits? And it's in that process, by providing feedback as you go through this learning on your own part as to why this person's underperforming, that if you give them the feedback on what your expectations are and they actually adopt it, you actually save them, right? Because you taught them how to do it.
Yeah.
If they come back with as empty a solution as they had before, even though you've given them direct feedback on how to do it, then they're not suited to do the job. And you need to either find them another job or have them develop outside the company.
Mark, how do you see an organization like the Center for Higher Ambition Leadership helping you and others on the journey?
I got engaged in the center probably, I think it's 6, 7 years ago. I think it was my first visit. Ed Ludwig, our lead director, actually it was 6 years ago. Ed Ludwig, our lead director, who's been involved in the center for a while, invited me and said, you ought to come and meet these people. You're the kind of guy that, might learn something from this. And I went, and I think initially it was, I was just learning about how people were thinking about this and what were the mechanics and the reasons why it should be powerful. And then I think as we continued meeting and I continued engaging with, people like Stan Bergman, Henry Schein and a few other folks, Dick, a few other folks around, Russ, the whole team, iteratively in the year between the meetings, it was sort of, I'm starting to get this. It makes some good sense. It's not just an academic exercise in, making everybody feel good. And I started talking to my board about it. And Ed's on the board, and he's the lead director, and he was very supportive. And the board started to get some energy behind it. And I think it gave me sort of ideas about how I can learn from the rest of the group, try ideas, and it was just sort of like a safe house, right? You could go in and talk about things without being labeled a nut, which is something you have to overcome internally first, but then you need to find people externally. And I was always taught that having your own external network that you can trust in, which I think is the thing that the center does, is creates a trusting environment. Chatham House Rules was very powerful. So I think that whole dialogue is a very important one. And I think we're all evolving as we go along and trying new things. And I think sharing best practices is an incredibly powerful thing. Studying the results of some of these best practices is important, and publishing work about what works and getting audiences external to us by saying, here are things that, we're looking at as a group that we think are important and that we ought to do more of, and that we ought to encourage other CEOs and other corporations. And so the invitation sort of nature of it and bringing more people in, I think, is all very powerful. And so I think that's all really good stuff. I think the organization's bigger than it was before. It's got a lot more legitimacy to it today. I think a lot more people are searching for what the next solution is. So you've now got sustainable capitalism movements, and you got conscious capitalism movements, and you got all these groups that now everybody wants me to come and talk with about, what are you guys doing? And I always mention the Center for Higher Ambition Leadership, because I think it's an important starting point for me, and sort of opened my eyes and allowed me to sort of spread my wings. And so I think more people joining us, you have a sort of a troop, and then it becomes a tribe, and then it becomes a movement, right? And so I think we're getting close to the movement stage. The tribe is pretty well established.
Well, thank you very much for being a part of the troop and the tribe to helping build a movement.
That's great.
And thank you for this interview
Thanks so
today.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.